There is a moment in every organ transplant surgery, a sacred, silent pause that hangs between life and death. It's the moment after the diseased organ has been removed and the donor organ this perfect, precious, impossible gift is lifted from its basin of ice. In that moment, the operating room, with all its beeping machines and clanking steel, becomes a cathedral, and for a few seconds, you, the surgeon, are holding a human soul in your hands. It's a moment of profound, terrifying humility. It's a moment that reminds you that for all your training, all your skill, you are just a mechanic, a humble, highly trained plumber for the miracles of the human body. That moment is my home. It's the only place I have ever felt truly, completely myself. My name is Dr. Alara Vance. I'm 38 years old, and for the past 10 years, my life has been a carefully orchestrated symphony of 18-hour workdays, life or death decisions, and the quiet, sterile solitude of the operating room. I am one of the best transplant surgeons in the country. My hands, which my mother always lamented were not delicate enough for a woman, have saved hundreds of lives. My mind, which my father always complained was too serious, has solved medical puzzles that have baffled other doctors. In the world of my hospital, I am a quiet, respected, and slightly feared authority. In the world of my family, I am a failure. If you've ever poured your entire soul into something, a career, a passion, a calling, only to have the people who are supposed to be your biggest fans look at it with a blank, uncomprehending stare, then you know what I'm talking about. It's a unique kind of heartbreak. Hit that like button if you've ever felt like your greatest accomplishments were completely invisible to your own family. My family's definition of success is very different from mine. Their success is loud and bright and easy to photograph. Their success is my younger brother, Liam. Liam is the golden boy. He's always been the sun around which our family has orbited. He's handsome, charismatic, and effortlessly charming. He was the high school quarterback, the prom king, the guy who could talk his way into any party and out of any trouble. Now, he's a successful entrepreneur who runs a string of trendy, high-end restaurants. His life is a highlight reel of opening nights, glowing magazine reviews, and beautiful women on his arm. He is the son my parents always wanted, the one who is fun at parties, the one who is always there for holidays, armed with expensive gifts and funny stories. I am the other one, the quiet, serious, and perpetually absent daughter. I was the girl who spent her weekends in the library, not at football games. I was the one who would bring a medical textbook to a family barbecue. My passion for science, for the intricate, beautiful machinery of the human body, was a mystery to them. They saw it as a strange, slightly morbid obsession. I remember the day I got my acceptance letter to the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, one of the top medical schools in the world. I was ecstatic. I had worked my entire life for that moment. I called my parents, my voice shaking with excitement. "That's wonderful, darling," my mother had said, her voice sounding a little distant. "But it's in Baltimore. That's so far away. And it's such a long program. Isn't it all that school? You'll be 30 before you're done." My father's reaction was even more telling. "Well, I suppose it's a respectable profession," he'd said, "but it's a demanding one, a man's profession. Really. You'll be working all the time. You'll never have time for a family, for a husband." They didn't see my acceptance as a monumental achievement. They saw it as a liability, a 10-year detour from what was supposed to be my real job, getting married and giving them grandchildren. Liam, on the other hand, had dropped out of college after 2 years to start his first business, a food truck. My parents had been horrified, at first, but when the food truck became a wild success, when he was lauded in the local papers as a visionary young entrepreneur, their horror turned to beaming pride. His success was fast and flashy, and it came with a good story. My success was a slow, quiet, and grueling grind. Over the years, the rift between their world and mine grew wider. I missed birthdays because I was in the middle of a 24-hour shift. I missed anniversaries because I was attending a medical conference. I missed holidays because I was on call. Each absence was another piece of evidence for their case against me. I was the selfish daughter, the one who put her career before her family. They didn't see it as a sacrifice. They didn't see that every holiday I missed was so that another family could have their loved one home for the holidays. They only saw their own inconvenience. The story I'm about to tell you begins, as so many of these stories do, with a phone call in the middle of the night. I had just finished a grueling 13-hour kidney transplant. The surgery had been a success. A 16-year-old girl who had been on dialysis for 2 years now had a new, healthy kidney, a gift from her older brother. It was a good day, one of the good days that made all the bad days worthwhile. I was at home, in my quiet, minimalist apartment that my sister-in-law had once called sad, trying to unwind. I had just stepped out of a long, hot shower when my phone rang. The screen glowed with my mother's name. It was 2 a.m. My heart immediately seized with a cold dread. "Mom," I answered, my voice sharp with a surgeon's efficiency. "What's wrong?" "Alara," she shrieked, her voice a raw, hysterical sound I had never heard before. "Oh my God, Alara, it's Liam, it's your brother." "Mom, calm down," I said, my own training kicking in. I was no longer a daughter, I was a doctor. "Tell me what happened," slowly. He was at the gym," she sobbed, her words punctuated by ragged gasps for air. He collapsed. He couldn't breathe. His face was, oh, God. It was horrible. The ambulance is here. They're taking him to the hospital." "Which hospital, Mom?" I asked, already pulling on my clothes, my mind racing through a dozen different diagnostic possibilities. An aneurysm, a heart attack, a stroke. "The big one downtown," she cried. "The University Medical Center." My blood ran cold. The University Medical Center, my hospital, the place where I wasn't just a surgeon, but a name, the place where I ran the entire transplant program. "I'm on my way," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the chaos that was suddenly raging inside me. "I'll meet you in the emergency room. Now listen to me. Let the paramedics do their work. And when you get there, just give them his name. Don't mention me. Not yet. Do you understand?" "I don't," why she stammered. "Just do it, Mom," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up and stood for a moment in the middle of my dark apartment, the city lights glittering coldly outside my window. My two worlds. The world where I was Dr. Vance, the respected surgeon, and the world where I was Alara, the disappointing daughter, were on a collision course, and the crash site was going to be the one place on earth I had always considered my sanctuary, my own hospital. I grabbed my keys and ran out the door, my mind a furious storm of medical possibilities. But underneath the doctor's analytical calm, the sister was terrified. My brother, my golden, invincible brother, was hurt. And for all our differences, for all the pain my family had caused me, the thought of losing him was a sharp, physical pain. I got to the emergency room in record time. It was the familiar, controlled chaos of a level 1 trauma center at 2 a.m. I bypassed the main entrance and used my staff ID to get in through the back. I found my family huddled in a small, private waiting room, their faces pale and drawn with fear. My father was pacing, my mother was weeping in a chair, even Liam's perfect, beautiful girlfriend was a mess, her mascara running down her face. They looked up as I entered, their eyes full of a desperate, pleading hope. In that moment, I wasn't the failed daughter, I was the doctor. I was the one person in the family who could possibly make sense of this nightmare. "What do we know?" I asked, my voice calm and professional. "They won't tell us anything," my father said, his own voice shaky. "Just that it's his kidneys. They said they've failed. Kidney failure, sudden, catastrophic kidney failure in a healthy 36-year-old man. It was rare, but not impossible." My mind immediately started cycling through the potential causes of a rare genetic condition, a sudden autoimmune response, a toxic exposure. Just then, a doctor I knew well, the head of the ER, Dr. Miller, walked in, a grim expression on his face. He saw me and his eyes widened in surprise. "Alara," he said, "I didn't know you were on call tonight." "I'm not," I said quickly, giving him a look that I hoped he would understand. "This is my family. My brother is the patient, Liam Torres." Understanding dawned on his face. He nodded, his expression becoming even more serious. Okay, he said, let's talk. He explained the situation. Liam's kidneys had completely shut down. They didn't know why yet. They had started him on emergency dialysis, but it was a temporary measure. His condition was critical. What you're saying, my father said, his voice trembling, is that he needs a new kidney? A transplant is his only long-term option. Yes, Dr. Miller said gently. We'll get him stabilized, and then we'll get him on the national transplant list. But it can be a long wait. A wait, my mother cried out. He doesn't have time for a wait. You saw him. There is another option, Dr. Miller said carefully. A living donor, a family member. If we can find a match, the process can be much faster. And then, it happened. A moment so surreal, so profoundly and unbelievably cruel, that it will be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. My mother, my father, and my brother's girlfriend all turned, in perfect, synchronized unison. And they looked at me. It wasn't a look of hope. It wasn't a look of pleading. It was a look of pure, unadulterated expectation. My mother was the one who spoke. She didn't look at me. She looked at Dr. Miller. Her voice was no longer the voice of a grieving mother. It was the voice of a woman making a demand. She can do it, my mother said, gesturing toward me with a dismissive wave of her hand, as if I were a piece of furniture. She's a match. We have the same blood type. I remember from when they were children. You can take hers. Take her kidney. Just save my son. She didn't ask me, she told him. She had just sentenced me, without a trial, without a question, to give up a piece of my own body to save the son she had always valued more. In her eyes, I wasn't a person, I was a solution, a collection of spare parts. My father nodded in grim agreement. That's right, she's healthy. She doesn't have any children. Her life is simple. She can do it. Do whatever you have to do. I stood there, in the harsh, fluorescent light of that hospital waiting room, and I felt the last, fragile thread of connection to my own family snap. They hadn't just insulted me. They had dehumanized me. They had offered me up as a sacrifice, without a moment's hesitation, without a single thought for my life, my health, my future. Dr. Miller looked at me, his face a mask of horrified, professional shock. He knew this was a catastrophic breach of medical ethics. He knew that I was not a piece of property to be offered up. But he didn't know the half of it. He didn't know the beautiful, terrible, and world-shattering secret that was now blooming in the middle of this family tragedy. He looked at my parents, then back at me, a look of profound pity in his eyes, for the woman whose family had just treated her like a lamb being led to the slaughter. They had no idea. They had just told the doctor to take my organ. They had no idea that the doctor they were talking to was just a resident. They had no idea that they were standing in my hospital, my world, and they had no idea that they had just made their desperate, unethical demand, directly in front of the one person who had the ultimate, final, and absolute say over any organ transplant that happened in that building, the director of the institute herself. Me for a long, silent moment. The only sound in that sterile little waiting room was the frantic, terrified beating of my own heart. My mother's words hung in the air, obscene and unbelievable. Take her kidney, just save my son. It wasn't a plea, it was a transaction, a pronouncement. She had, in front of a medical professional, offered up my body as if it were a used car she was trading in for a better model. I watched the face of my colleague, Dr. Miller. He was a seasoned ER doctor, a man who had seen every kind of human desperation and tragedy. But I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before, a look of pure, unadulterated, professional horror. He was looking at my parents as if they were a rare and dangerous new species of monster. He was the first to speak, his voice a carefully controlled model of professional calm. But I could hear the shock underneath it. Mr. and Mrs. Torres, he began, his eyes flicking to me for a fraction of a second with a look of profound sympathy. I understand this is an incredibly difficult time for you, but we need to be very clear. That is not how organ donation works. My father, who had been nodding along with my mother's horrific pronouncement, bristled. What do you mean? That's not how it works, he demanded, his voice full of the arrogant impatience of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. It's a simple solution. He needs a kidney. She has one. She's a match. What's the problem? The problem, sir, Dr. Miller said, his voice becoming a little firmer, is that organ donation from a living donor is a voluntary medical procedure. It is a gift. It can never be a demand. It is a decision that only the potential donor, and the potential donor alone, can make, after extensive medical and psychological evaluation, completely free from any form of coercion or pressure. He was giving them the textbook definition of medical ethics, a concept that was so foreign to my family. It might as well have been in another language. Coercion, my mother cried, her voice rising with indignation. This isn't coercion, this is family. This is a mother trying to save her son's life. What could be more important than that? Alara understands. She'll do it. Of course she will. She's his sister. They were talking about me as if I wasn't even in the room. I was an object, a topic of debate. My body, my health, my life were all secondary to the one, central, undeniable fact of their universe. Liam's needs came first. They always had. I had to get out of that room. I felt the walls closing in, the air thick and unbreathable with the poison of their lifelong disregard for me. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I held up a hand, a gesture that was so out of character for the quiet, accommodating daughter they knew that it actually silenced them for a moment. I need a minute, I said, my voice a hoarse whisper. Excuse me, before they could protest. I turned and walked out of the waiting room, my movements stiff and robotic. I walked down the bright, sterile corridor of the emergency department, my own hospital, and it felt like I was walking through a dream. The familiar sights and sounds, the beep of monitors, the quiet urgency of the nurses, the smell of antiseptic were a surreal backdrop to the emotional carnage that had just taken place. I needed to get to my sanctuary, my office, the one place in this building, in this world, where I was not a daughter, not a sister, not a collection of spare parts, but a person of authority, a person in command. I took the staff elevator up to the 7th floor. The 7th floor was my world. It was the home of the University Medical Center's Organ Transplant Institute. The doors opened onto a quiet, carpeted hallway lined with framed medical journals and portraits of the institute's founders. It was a world away from the chaos of the ER. It was a place of quiet, life-altering miracles. I walked down the hall to the last door on the left. The plaque on the door was made of polished brass. It read, Dr. Alara Vance, M.D., D.F.A.C.S., Executive Director. I keyed in the code and the heavy door clicked open. I stepped inside and closed it behind me, leaning against the cool, solid wood for a moment. My eyes closed. I was home. My office was large and quiet, and it looked out over the glittering lights of the city. One wall was floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with the defining texts of transplant surgery and immunology. Another wall was covered in a large whiteboard, currently filled with complex diagrams from a research project I was leading on ischemic reperfusion injury. This room was my brain, my heart, my life's work, made manifest. I walked over to my large, uncluttered desk and sank into my leather chair, and in the safe, profound silence of my own office, I finally allowed myself to feel the full, devastating impact of what my family had just done. It wasn't just the demand for my kidney, it was the casual, unthinking, an absolute dehumanization of it. Take her kidney. They had spoken of my body as if it were a resource, a community asset to be plundered for the greater good of the family. The greater good, of course, being my brother, Liam. And I realized, with a sudden, sickening clarity, that this was not a new development. This was a pattern that had defined my entire life. I had always been the resource. I was the smart one. So it was my job to tutor Liam through high school, to practically write his college application essays for him. I was the responsible one. So it was my job to lend him the money I had painstakingly saved from my part-time jobs when he got into a gambling debt in college. I was the quiet one. So it was my job to listen to my mother's endless complaints, to be the silent, emotional dumping ground for the family's anxieties. And now I was the healthy, single, childless one, the one with the simple life. So it was my job to provide the spare parts, to give up a piece of my own body, to risk my own health, to jeopardize the career of the very hands that my family had always implicitly resented, to save the golden child. The sheer, bitter irony of the situation was a taste like acid in the back of my throat. They had come to my hospital, the organ transplant institute that I had built, from the ground up, into one of the most respected programs in the world. They had walked into my kingdom, and they had tried to sacrifice me on my own altar, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the one who ruled it. They thought of me as a failure, the daughter who had wasted her life on a demanding, unfeminine career. That career, that very failure, had given me the power of a god in this situation. My brother's life was now in my hands, not just in the metaphorical sense of being a potential donor, but in the absolute, literal sense of being the director of the institute. I was the one who set the protocols. I was the one who chaired the ethics committee. I was the one who had the final, undeniable say on who got a transplant, and under what circumstances. The power they had spent their lives denying me was now the only power that mattered. A deep, shuddering breath escaped my lips. This was a conflict of interest of such epic, Shakespearean proportions that it would have been almost comical if it wasn't so deeply, personally painful. I had spent my career navigating the most complex ethical dilemmas in modern medicine. I had decided the fates of hundreds of strangers, always guided by a strict, unwavering code of ethics and the core principle of doing no harm. But this was different. This was not a stranger. This was my brother. And the people who were trying to coerce a donation were my own parents. My professional duty was clear. The family's behavior was a massive red flag, the clear evidence of coercion, the complete disregard for the donor's autonomy. If this were any other family, I would have already flagged the case for an immediate mandatory ethics review. I would have put a stop to any talk of a family donation until a full psychological evaluation could be completed. But the personal dilemma, that was a tangled, thorny mess. It was my brother, my little brother, who I had, despite everything, loved. The memory of him as a small boy, following me around, looking at me with a pure, uncomplicated adoration, was a ghost that haunted the edges of my anger. He was lying in a hospital bed a few floors below me, fighting for his life. And I was his sister. Could I do it? Could I set aside the lifetime of pain, of being dismissed and devalued? Could I willingly offer up a piece of myself to save the person my family had always loved more? And then, a second, colder question emerged. Even if I wanted to, could I, ethically, allow it, could I, as the director of this institute, approve a donation where the donor had been so clearly, so brutally, and so publicly coerced to do so, would be a betrayal of every principle I had ever stood for. It would be a betrayal of my oath. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sleeping city. The weight on my shoulders was immense. It was the weight of a woman's body, a sister's love, a doctor's oath, and a director's duty. They had told the doctor to take my organ. They had no idea that in doing so, they had not given him a solution. They had given me, their failed daughter, an impossible and terrible choice. I sat in the dark of my office for a long time, the glittering cityscape outside my window a silent, indifferent witness to the implosion of my world. The silence was absolute. It was the same silence I had always craved after a long, grueling surgery. But this was not a peaceful silence. It was the dead, airless silence of a vacuum, the silence of profound, soul-deep shock. In the aftermath of a trauma, the mind does strange things to protect itself. My own mind, the one I had trained for decades to be a precision instrument of logic and analysis, fractured into two warring entities. It was a civil war in the kingdom of my own skull. The first voice was Ilara, the sister. She was a ghost, a pale, weeping figure from my past. She was the little girl who had hero-worshipped her charming, funny older brother. She remembered him teaching her how to throw a baseball, his voice full of a rare, uncomplicated pride. She remembered him defending her from a bully in middle school. Her love for him was a deep, foundational thing, a part of my own source code, and her grief was a raw, physical agony. "He's dying," she whispered. "Liam is dying. You have to save him." It doesn't matter what they said. It doesn't matter what they did. He's your brother. You have 2 kidneys. He needs 1. It's that simple. The sister was willing to do anything, to sacrifice anything, to endure any humiliation, to save him. She was a creature of pure, primal, and unconditional love, but the second voice was louder, stronger. It was the voice of Dr. Vance, the director. Her voice was not a whisper. It was a cold, clear, and utterly calm pronouncement. The voice I used in the operating room when a patient was crashing. It was the voice of command, and Dr. Vance was appalled. She was not looking at a grieving family. She was looking at a case file, a catastrophic breach of the most sacred principles of her profession. Coercion, she stated. The words, a clinical diagnosis. The subject, a potential living donor, was subjected to extreme emotional and psychological pressure by her immediate family in a clinical setting. Consent was not requested, but demanded. The subject's bodily autonomy was completely violated. The family's behavior presents a clear and present danger to the ethical integrity of the transplant program. Dr. Vance saw my parents' words not as a cry of desperation, but as a crime, a violation of the very first rule of her world, primum non nocere. First, do no harm. And they had done harm. The harm they had inflicted on me was as real and as damaging as any surgical wound. The sister wept, the director analyzed, and I, the woman who was both of them, just sat there, torn in two. My mind, seeking refuge from the present, fled into the past. It landed on a specific memory, a case from about a year ago. It had been one of the most difficult ethical challenges of my career. The case involved a young man in his 20s with a rare liver disease who needed a partial liver transplant from a living donor. His only match was his older sister. The problem was, they were estranged. He was the golden boy, a successful young lawyer, and she was the family black sheep, an artist who had been cut off for her bohemian lifestyle. The family, the parents, and the brother had waged a relentless campaign of pressure on her. They had offered her money. They had threatened to disinherit her completely. They had bombarded her with guilt-tripping phone calls. Finally, broken down, she had agreed to be tested. She had passed the physical evaluation. But the final hurdle was the ethics committee review, a meeting that I, as the director, personally chaired. I remember her sitting in our boardroom, a pale, haunted-looking young woman in a paint-splattered t-shirt, surrounded by her well-dressed, aggressive family and their lawyer. My job in that meeting was simple: to determine if her consent was truly voluntary. I had looked at her, past her family, past the lawyers. I have one question for you, I had said, and I need you to answer it honestly. If you were a stranger on the street, and you read about your brother's case in the newspaper, would you volunteer to be his donor? She had looked at her parents, her face full of fear. Then she had looked at her brother, her face full of a deep, complicated pain. And then she had looked back at me, and a single tear had traced a path down her cheek. No, she had whispered. I had ended the meeting right there. I had denied the transplant. The family had exploded in a firestorm of rage. Their lawyer had threatened to sue me, the hospital, everyone. The brother had called me a monster, but I had held firm, because the rule is absolute. A coerced gift is not a gift. It is a theft. To proceed with that surgery would have been a violation of my oath, a betrayal of my patient, and in that room, the sister, the donor, was just as much my patient as her brother. Now, sitting in the dark of my own office, the irony of that memory was a suffocating weight. I had been the fierce, unwavering protector of that stranger's bodily autonomy. And now, my own body, my own autonomy, was under assault from my own family, in my own hospital. How could I possibly approve a transplant for my brother under these circumstances? To do so would make me the world's biggest hypocrite. It would be a betrayal of every ethical ruling I had ever made. It would be a betrayal of that scared young artist I had protected. But how could I say no? This wasn't a stranger. This was Liam, my brother. To deny the transplant could be a death sentence for him. To say no would be to prove my family right. It would be the ultimate fulfillment of their narrative of me as the cold, selfish, and unloving daughter. I stood up and began to pace the length of my office, from the window overlooking the city to the bookshelves filled with the wisdom of my profession. The sister and the director were locked in a battle for control of my soul. The sister pleaded for mercy, for family, for love. The director demanded justice, for ethics, for the rule of law. For hours, I paced. For hours, they fought. And then, slowly, a third voice began to emerge. It wasn't the weeping of the sister or the cold analysis of the director. It was a new voice, a quiet, steady, and unfamiliar voice. It was the voice of Alara, the woman. And she was angry. She was angry at my parents for their cruelty. She was angry at my brother for his lifelong, casual acceptance of his role as the favorite. She was angry at the scared young artist for not being strong enough. And she was angry at me, at both my warring selves, for even entertaining this impossible choice. This is not your choice to make, this new voice said. They put you in this position. They created this ethical nightmare. You are not the one on trial here. They are, and with that thought, the path forward became clear. I had been trying to solve this problem as a sister and as a doctor. It was time to solve it as a director. I could not be the subject of the case and the judge at the same time. I had to remove myself from the emotional equation. I had to treat my own family, my own body, as a formal case file, a problem to be managed through the strict, impersonal, and unbendable application of protocol. My family thought they could bully their way through this. They thought their desperation gave them the right to break the rules. I was about to teach them that in my world. The rules do not break. The rules are the only thing that separates us from the chaos. I sat down at my desk. My hands were steady now. The Civil War was over. The director was in command. But she was now serving a new client, Alara Vance, the woman. I picked up my phone. I didn't call my family. I called Dr. Ann Sharma, my hospital's chief of psychology and my most trusted colleague on the ethics committee. Ann, it's Alara, I said. Alara, it's 3 a.m. Is everything okay? I have a situation, I said, my voice all business, and I need to formally recuse myself from a case and request your oversight. I explained the situation in the most clinical, detached terms I could manage. We have a new patient, critical renal failure, name is Liam Torres. The family has identified a potential living donor, a sister, however. During the initial consultation in the ER, the family, specifically the parents, exhibited what I would classify as extreme and overt coercive behavior toward the potential donor. Oh, God, Alara, she said, her voice full of sympathy. I need the case to be flagged. I continued, my voice unwavering. I want a full, independent psychological evaluation for the entire family, including the patient, and especially for the donor. I want her to have a dedicated patient advocate, someone from outside the transplant department, to ensure she is fully aware of her rights. I want this handled by the book, Anne, by the strictest, most rigorous interpretation of our protocols. Of course, Alara. I'll handle it personally first thing in the morning. There's one more thing, I said, and the words felt like ice in my mouth. The potential donor, the sister, it's me. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Alara, she finally whispered, I am so sorry. Don't be, I said, and a strange, cold sense of power began to fill the void where the pain had been. Just follow the protocol. Treat me like you would any other potential donor in a high-risk coercion case. No special treatment, no shortcuts. Protect me from them. I hung up the phone. I had done it. I had set the wheels of the great, impersonal machine of hospital bureaucracy in motion. My family thought they were in a simple negotiation with a doctor. They had no idea they were now the subject of a formal ethical investigation. An investigation I had just personally, and secretly, launched against them. They wanted to take a piece of my body. They had no idea I was about to subject their minds, and their motives, to the full, unblinking scrutiny of my world. The battle had just begun. The next morning, I was in my office at 6 a.m. I had not slept. I had spent the night staring out at the city lights. The war between the sister and the director finally settled into a cold, hard, and unwavering truce. The sister had agreed to grieve quietly. The director was now in full command. My mission was no longer to save my brother. It was to navigate this crisis in a way that protected the integrity of my hospital, the sanctity of my profession, and the last, tattered remnants of my own soul. I had set a machine in motion, a machine of pure, unbendable protocol. My family, who had always operated in a world of emotion, manipulation, and the sheer force of my father's will, was about to collide with a world where none of those things mattered, a world where the only things that mattered were rules, ethics, and the cold, hard facts of the case. My first update came from my lead transplant coordinator, a brilliant, tough-as-nails former ICU nurse named Carol. She had been with me for 10 years, and she could spot a coercive family dynamic from a mile away. I had briefed her on the case, omitting the fact that I was the sister in question, framing it as a high-risk situation that needed to be handled with extreme care. I just had my initial meeting with the parents of Liam Torres. She told me over the phone, her voice a flat, professional monotone that I knew was her signal for "you are not going to believe this." And I asked, leaning back in my chair, and it was a Category 5 disaster. She said, "I've been doing this for 20 years, Alara. I have seen it all, but this family, they're in a league of their own." I went in there to do the standard preliminary briefing, explain the process, the risks to the donor, the recovery time, the absolute necessity of voluntary consent. They cut me off before I could even get through the first slide of the presentation. I could picture it perfectly. My father, impatient and arrogant. My mother, fluttering with anxiety. The father, Mr. Torres, actually waved his hand at me and said, "We don't have time for all this bureaucracy. Nurse, we have a donor, his sister. She's a match. Let's get on with it. When can you schedule the surgery?" Nurse, he had called Carol, a woman with a master's degree in nursing and 2 decades of specialized experience. A nurse in that dismissive tone he used for anyone he considered a service worker. I calmly explained that that was not how the process worked. Carol continued, her voice tight with a controlled fury I knew well. I explained that the potential donor, Ms. Torres, would have to undergo her own separate evaluation and that the decision to donate was hers and hers alone. I told them their consent was, with all due respect, irrelevant to the process. How did they take that, I asked, already knowing the answer. The father went ballistic. He started yelling about how this hospital was wasting precious time with paperwork, while his son was dying. He actually said to me, "Are you telling me that I, as her father, don't have a say in what my own daughter does? I am her father. I am telling you she will do it." My stomach clenched. He had said it again. He had laid claim to my body, to my life, as if I were a piece of his property to be disposed of as he saw fit. The mother was worse, in a way. Carol said she started crying, telling me I didn't understand. That Ilara, that's the sister's name, apparently would be happy to do it, that she would be honored to save her brother, that it was the most important thing she would ever do with her life. The most important thing I would ever do. More important than the hundreds of lives I had already saved. My own mother believed that my greatest possible purpose was to serve as an organ farm for her favorite child. I held my ground, of course. Carol said, I gave them the pamphlets. I told them the next step was a mandatory preliminary session with a psychologist for them, and a separate one for the patient, and a third one for the potential donor. The father threw the pamphlet on the floor. "Thank you, Carol," I said, my voice quiet. "You handled it perfectly." "This is a bad one, Alara," she said, her professional guard dropping for a moment. "This sister, this Alara, she's going to need a strong advocate. This family is going to try to eat her alive." "Don't worry," I said, a cold resolve settling over me. She has one. The next report came a few hours later, from Dr. Ann Sharma, the head of psychology. She had just finished her evaluation sessions with my parents. She came to my office and closed the door behind her, her face grim. "Okay," she said, sinking into the chair opposite my desk. "You were not exaggerating. Tell me." I met with them together, as is standard for the initial spousal consult. She began. I started with the basic questions. "Tell me about your son, Liam. Tell me about your daughter, Alara. And the difference in their responses was textbook, pathological. Even, she flipped open her notebook. When they talk about Liam, they use words like brilliant, charming, successful, the light of our lives. They told me stories about his business success, about how popular he is. But when I asked them to tell me about Alara, there was this long, blank pause. She looked at me, her eyes full of a clinical pity. The mother, Helen, finally said, "Well, Alara is very quiet, very dedicated to her work. She's a good girl." That was it. That's all they had. They defined their son by his accomplishments and their daughter by her quiet compliance. My entire life, summed up in a single sentence: she's a good girl. Then I moved on to the more direct questions, and continued. I asked them, "Tell me about the conversation you had with your daughter about her being a potential donor." And the father, Richard, said, "What's there to talk about? It's obvious. It's the logical solution." He spoke of his own daughter's major, life-altering surgery as if he were talking about a simple math problem. I asked them if they had discussed the risks with her, Anne said, her voice dropping. The significant risks of a nephrectomy, the pain, the recovery time, the lifelong implications of living with one kidney, the risk, however small, of death. And I prompted. They looked at me like I was insane, she said. Shaking her head in disbelief, the mother actually said, "But the risk to Liam is so much greater if she doesn't do it. They are literally incapable of seeing you, of seeing the sister as a separate human being with her own health, her own risks, her own life, in their minds. You are a factor in an equation, and the only variable that matters is Liam's survival." The clinical, detached way Anne was describing it was both horrifying and profoundly validating. I wasn't crazy. The dysfunction I had been swimming in my whole life was real. It was a textbook case. The final nail in the coffin, Anne said, leaning forward, was when I asked them the key question, the one we always ask in these cases. What would happen to your relationship with your daughter if, for any reason, she is unable or unwilling to donate? I held my breath. The father just scoffed. Anne said, he said, "That's not going to happen." And the mother started to cry, and she said, "If she didn't do it, if she let her brother die, I don't think I could ever look at her again. She wouldn't be our daughter anymore." There it was, the final, brutal truth, laid bare in a sterile hospital office. Their love for me was not just conditional, it was transactional. I was their daughter only so long as I was useful to their son. So, Anne said, closing her notebook, my official, professional, psychological assessment is that the parents are exerting an unacceptable and extreme level of emotional and psychological coercion on the potential donor. They have created a toxic environment in which true, voluntary consent is impossible. I have officially flagged this case, and my recommendation to the Ethics Committee will be to deny any living family donation at this time, and to keep the patient on the national transplant list. Her professional duty was done. She had made the right call, the call I would have made. She had protected the anonymous, vulnerable donor, Alara Torres. "Thank you, Anne," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. It was a mixture of gratitude, sorrow, and a strange, bitter vindication. "What happens now?" she asked gently. "Now," I said, standing up and looking out the window, my decision made, now. The committee has to convene for a formal review. It's standard procedure in a flagged case. "But you're the chair of that committee, Alara," she said, confused. "You've recused yourself. Who's going to run the meeting?" I turned back to look at her, and my face was a mask of cold, hard resolve. The sister was gone. The director was in full, absolute command. "Oh, I'm not recusing myself from the case anymore." I said, "I'm recusing myself as the potential donor." Anne's eyes went wide. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying my family wants to make their case. They want to argue that their love for their son overrides all of our rules. So I'm going to give them a forum to do that." I said, "I'm calling an emergency meeting of the full Transplant Ethics Committee tomorrow morning, and I will be chairing it. My family is about to find out that they have to make their appeal, not to a group of strangers, but directly to the daughter they just tried to sacrifice." The next morning, A formal, hand-delivered summons was sent to my parents' hotel room across the street from the hospital. It was printed on the hospital's official letterhead, heavy cream-colored paper embossed with the seal of the University Medical Center. It was a beautiful, intimidating, and utterly impersonal document. It read, "You are hereby requested to appear before the Transplant Ethics Committee for a mandatory review concerning the case of patient Liam Torres. The meeting will be held at 10:00 a.m. in the main boardroom on the executive 7th floor of the Organ Transplant Institute. Your attendance is not optional." There was no signature, just the typed, official title Office of the Executive Director. I had set the stage. I had sent the summons. I had, in effect, subpoenaed my own parents. They thought they were coming to the hospital to bully a few doctors into giving them what they wanted. They had no idea they were about to stand trial. I spent the morning preparing, not as a daughter, but as a director. I didn't think about my brother, lying in his hospital bed. I didn't think about my mother's tears or my father's rage. I compartmentalized all of it, locking the emotional, wounded sister away in a deep, secure vault in my own mind. Today, I was only Dr. Vance. I reviewed the case file. It was all there, in the cold, objective language of medical reports, Dr. Miller's notes from the ER, detailing the family's unusual and highly coercive behavior, Carol's report from her meeting, quoting my father's assertion that he had the right to decide what his daughter did with her body. And finally, Dr. Sharma's devastating psychological assessment, concluding that true voluntary consent from the potential donor is impossible under the current circumstances of extreme familial pressure and emotional coercion. It was a textbook case, an open and shut ethical nightmare, and I was about to walk into the middle of it. I dressed for battle, not in my surgeon's scrubs, but in my director's uniform, a sharply tailored, dark gray suit, a crisp white blouse, and simple, low heels. My hair was pulled back in a tight, severe chignon. My face was a neutral, professional mask. I was no longer a participant in this drama. I was its judge. The ethics committee boardroom was my territory. It was a large, intimidating space, designed to convey power and seriousness. A massive, polished mahogany table that seated 20 dominated the center of the room. The chairs were heavy, black leather. The walls were lined with medical and legal texts. One wall was a sheet of glass that looked out over the hospital campus, a constant reminder of the world of medicine we were all sworn to serve. The committee was already assembled when I arrived. Dr. Sharma, the hospital's chief legal counsel, a formidable woman named Jessica, our head of surgery, a respected bioethicist from the university, a patient advocate. They were the jury. They all stood when I entered the room. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm and even. I took my seat at the head of the table, in the largest of the black leather chairs. "Thank you all for being here on such short notice. Let's review the file before the family arrives." We spent the next 30 minutes going over the facts. I presented the case with the cool, detached precision of a law professor. I laid out the medical details, the family dynamic as reported by the staff, and the specific ethical guidelines that had been violated. There were no pictures of me or my family in the file. To the committee, this was an anonymous case. The potential donor was referred to only as Subject A. At precisely 10:00 a.m., my administrative assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Dr. Vance, Mr. and Mrs. Torres are here to see the committee." "Send them in," I said. I swiveled my large, high-backed leather chair around so that I was facing the window, my back to the door. I wanted to see them, but I didn't want them to see me, not yet. The boardroom doors opened. I heard them enter the room. I could hear my father's confident, heavy footsteps on the thick carpet. I could hear my mother's nervous, fluttering breaths. "Good morning," the hospital lawyer, Jessica, said. "I am Jessica Ryland, the hospital's general counsel. This is the Transplant Ethics Committee. Please, have a seat." I could imagine the scene perfectly. My father, looking around the intimidating room, his arrogance probably tempered with a slight nervousness. My mother, looking small and scared. They would be trying to assess the room, to figure out who was in charge, who they needed to persuade. "I am Dr. Ann Sharma, head of psychology," I heard Anne's calm voice say. "And this meeting is being chaired by our hospital's highest authority on these matters, the executive director of the Transplant Institute, and the head of our ethics committee. That was my cue. Slowly, deliberately, I swiveled my chair around to face them. And you guys, you know that moment in a movie when the record scratches and the entire party comes to a screeching halt? It was like that. The look on their faces. It was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing I have ever seen. My mother saw me first. Her face, which had been a mask of nervous anxiety, went completely slack. A small, strangled gasp escaped her lips, and her hand flew to her chest. She looked as if she had just seen a ghost. My father's reaction was slower, but more profound. His eyes, which had been scanning the faces of the other doctors with a look of arrogant disdain, finally landed on me, sitting at the head of the table, in the seat of absolute power. His jaw literally dropped. The color drained from his face, his confident, entitled posture collapsed, and he seemed to shrink before my very eyes. He was a king who had just walked into his own throne room to find it occupied by the daughter he had exiled. They just stared. Their brains, their entire understanding of the world, of me, of their place in it, were breaking in real time. The daughter they had tried to sacrifice, the failure, the quiet, compliant girl, was sitting at the head of a table of powerful strangers, and she was the one in charge. I let the silence stretch. I let them sit in the profound, stunning, and deeply uncomfortable shock of it all. I wanted them to understand. I wanted them to feel the full, crushing weight of the power they had never known I possessed. Finally, I was the one to speak. My voice, amplified slightly by the small microphone on the conference table, was calm, cold, and utterly professional. It was the voice of the director. "Good morning, Mr. Torres, Mrs. Torres," I said. I used their formal names, a deliberate act of creating distance, of establishing a new protocol. "My name is Dr. Alara Vance. I will be chairing this meeting. Please, have a seat." They sank into the two chairs opposite me, their movements stiff and robotic, like two puppets whose strings had just been cut. They couldn't take their eyes off me. "Let's begin," I said. Looking down at the file in front of me, I did not look at them again. I addressed the committee. "As you know, we are here to review the case of Liam Torres, a patient in acute renal failure. The primary issue before this committee is the determination of consent regarding a potential living family donor. Identified in the file as Subject A, I continued in this vein for several minutes, laying out the facts of the case in the most sterile, impersonal language possible. I was performing my duty. I was being the director, and with every professional, detached word I spoke, I was dismantling their world, brick by brick. My father finally found his voice. It was a strangled, hoarse whisper. "Alara, what is this?" I stopped and slowly raised my eyes to look at him. I did not smile. My expression was a perfect, unreadable blank. "This, Mr. Torres," I replied, my voice still perfectly, chillingly professional, "is a transplant ethics committee review. It is a standard, mandatory procedure in all cases where there is evidence of potential donor coercion, and in my 20 years in this field, this is one of the most egregious cases of coercion I have ever seen." My mother let out a small, wounded sob. "The reports from the staff," I continued, my gaze unwavering, "indicate that you, Mr. and Mrs. Torres, attempted to make a unilateral decision regarding the body of another adult human being. You told a medical professional to take her kidney, as if it were your property to give. You are here today to explain to this committee why you believe that your parental relationship gives you the right to violate the fundamental principles of medical ethics and your own daughter's bodily autonomy." I leaned forward slightly. "So, please," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous level, "explain it to us. I'm particularly interested in your reasoning." My father just stared at me, his face a mask of utter impotent rage and humiliation. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no power here. His anger, his bluster, his demands, they were all useless. He was not in his living room. He was in mine, and in my world. The only thing that mattered was the truth, and the truth was not on his side. My father stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, but no sound came out. My question, my simple, Professional requests for him to explain his reasoning had rendered him completely, utterly powerless. His rage, his entitlement, his lifelong belief in his own paternal authority. All of it was useless in this room. This was not his home. This was not his dinner table. This was my boardroom. And in my boardroom, the only currency that had any value was the truth, and he was bankrupt. He looked to my mother for help, but she was a wreck, weeping silently into a tissue, her eyes wide with fear and shame. He looked at my brother-in-law, Stephen, who was looking down at the polished mahogany table as if it held the secrets to the universe. No one could save him. He was alone, exposed under the harsh, fluorescent lights of his own hypocrisy. I did not let him off the hook. I let the silence stretch, filling the room with the immense, uncomfortable weight of his own failure as a father. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice a broken, pleading whisper. We were just scared. Alara, she sobbed. We were so scared of losing him. We weren't thinking. We would never want to hurt you. We just love your brother so much. It was the closest she would ever come to an apology. And it was, in its own way, the most honest thing she had ever said. We just love your brother so much that you were willing to sacrifice your daughter without a second thought. So much that my life, my health, my body, were all acceptable collateral damage in the war to save him. I looked at her, at this small, broken woman who was my mother, and I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a profound, bottomless pity. I turned my attention to the committee, my voice returning to its cool, professional tone. The committee has heard the testimony of Mr. and Mrs. Torres, I said. It is the finding of this committee that there is clear and convincing evidence of a coercive environment that makes voluntary consent from the potential donor. Subject A, impossible at this time. I looked at my parents. Thank you for your time. Your presence is no longer required. A patient advocate will meet you in the waiting area to discuss the next steps for your son. It was a dismissal I had, in the most formal and professional way possible, just kicked my own parents out of my office. My father, finally finding his voice, sputtered, You can't just... But the hospital's lawyer, Jessica, cut him off. Mr. Torres, she said, her voice like ice. The director has made her ruling. This meeting is over. They stood, humbled and broken, and allowed a nurse to escort them out of the room. As the door closed behind them, a profound silence fell over the boardroom. The jury, my colleagues, all looked at me, their faces a mixture of professional respect and a deep, personal sympathy. You okay? Alara Ann Sharma asked gently. I took a deep breath. I will be, I said. We sat there for a moment. The director had done her duty. The doctor had upheld her oath. The professional crisis was over, and now, in the quiet aftermath, the sister was finally allowed to speak. My brother was dying. All the anger, all the hurt, all the bitter irony, none of it changed that fundamental, terrible fact. My brother was lying in a hospital bed a few floors below, his body failing, and his only real hope for a future was a kidney that was currently inside my body. My family, in their clumsy, cruel, and panicked way, had been right about one thing. I was a match. I had known it from the beginning. I had been tested years ago when Liam had considered donating bone marrow for a friend. Our blood type was the same, our HLA markers a near-perfect match. I was his best, and perhaps his only, hope. They had tried to take it from me. They had tried to demand it, to claim it as their right, and in doing so, they had forfeited any claim to my loyalty, to my love, to my sacrifice. But their actions did not change my own heart. The love I had for my brother, buried as it was under a lifetime of hurt and resentment, was still there. And the doctor in me, the healer, the woman who had sworn an oath to preserve life whenever possible, could not turn her back on a patient in need, especially when that patient was my little brother. I had won. I had shattered their power. I had established my authority. I had, in a quiet, clinical, and devastating way, brought my family to its knees. And now, from this new position of absolute power, I was finally free to make a choice, not a sacrifice, not a surrender, a choice. I looked at my colleagues, my jury, my friends, Thank you all, I said, my voice quiet but clear. The official finding of this committee stands. The hospital will not approve a directed family donation under coercive circumstances. The patient, Liam Torres, will remain on the national transplant list. I paused. However, I continued. There is another matter, a personal one. As a private citizen, I would like to formally volunteer to undergo the evaluation to be a non-directed living donor, if I am found to be a match for any patient in need. And if my brother happens to be at the top of that list, then that would be a fortunate coincidence. But my donation, if it happens, will not be a family matter. It will be an anonymous gift, made of my own free will. Through the proper, ethical channels, Anne Sharma smiled a small, sad, and beautiful smile. She understood. I was not saving my family. I was saving my brother. But I was doing it on my own terms. I was using the very rules and protocols they had despised to launder their cruelty out of the equation, leaving only the pure, clean, and voluntary act of a gift. The rest is a story of medicine, not of drama. I went through the rigorous evaluation process, not as the director, but as subject A. I met with the psychologists, the social workers, the patient advocates. I was asked the same hard questions they asked every donor. Are you being pressured? Do you understand the risks? Is this your choice? And your choice alone. And I could finally, honestly, answer yes, because it was my choice, not my father's command, not my mother's plea, my choice. I was, of course, a perfect match. The surgery took place 2 weeks later. I was the anonymous donor in OR3. Liam was the recipient in OR4. Our two worlds, which had been in such violent conflict, were now quietly, surgically, being stitched back together. I saw him for the first time a day after the surgery. I was shuffling down the hospital corridor in my patient gown, an IV pole, my dance partner, and he was being wheeled out of his room for a test. Our eyes met. His face was pale and weak, but his eyes were clear, and the look in them was one I had never seen before. The lifelong, casual arrogance was gone. The easy, golden boy charm was gone. In their place was a look of such profound, humbled, and overwhelming gratitude that it took my breath away. "Alara," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Hey, little brother," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. He just shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. There are no words. Thank you. "You're my brother, Liam," I said. "It's that simple." And it was, in the end, it was that simple. Our family is not healed. It is not whole. The damage of a lifetime cannot be erased by a single, dramatic act. My relationship with my parents is a quiet, distant, and formal thing now. It is built on their new, fearful respect for me, which is not the same as love, but it is better than their pity. But my relationship with my brother, that is a new and fragile thing, a seed planted in the scorched earth of our old life. He is recovering. We talk, really talk. For the first time, he is learning to see me. Not as the strange, serious sister who was never any fun, but as the woman who, when it mattered most, held his life in her hands and chose to give it back to him. My life is quiet now. I am back in the operating room, back in my office. But something inside me has changed. The old, aching need for their approval is gone. I am no longer defined by their perception of me. My worth is not something they can grant or withhold. It is a fundamental part of who I am. So that's my story. It's a story about the day my family tried to treat me like a means to an end. It's the story of how I had to become a doctor, a director, and a judge, all to finally give myself the freedom to just be a sister. The ultimate lesson is this: true sacrifice can only come from a place of power. A gift that is demanded is not a gift. And sometimes, the only way to truly save your family is to first, and finally, save yourself. Thank you for listening. If you've ever had to fight for your own autonomy, for your own voice, hit that like and subscribe button, and tell me in the comments about a time you had to make your own choice. On your own terms. Be good to yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.